When was the last time you received something in the mail? Maybe a package, clothing, medicine, or a card, letter, or a magazine? We're willing to bet that you've been served recently by the U.S. Postal Service. Why? Because the U.S. Postal Service processes and delivers more than 146 billion pieces of mail and packages each year. That's more than 450 mail pieces for every single person in America, and 47% of the entire world's mail. Why and how does the U.S. Postal Service deliver so many packages and mail pieces? Our Postal Service is the beating heart of a huge industry. A vast array of businesses rely on the Postal Service to deliver and receive goods. These businesses provide $1.4 trillion in commerce, employ 7.5 million people, and generate at least 90% of postal revenues each year. That's nearly 7% of U.S. GDP in 2018. There's also an entire private sector supply chain supporting the postal industry, from the paper companies to the printers to the suppliers of hardware and software, to envelope and box manufacturers, to every type of mailer or shipper. There is a complete ecosystem of support for this complex set of businesses. That supply chain enables the Postal Service to mail and ship personal and business communications, as well as anything you order online or elsewhere to any location in the country. In fact, the Postal Service goes everywhere every day, fulfilling what's called its universal service obligation. From the biggest cities to the smallest towns and isolated farms in rural America, the Postal Service serves more than 158 million delivery points across the country, going the last mile to deliver mail, including food, medicine, supplies, and communications, no matter the weather or how far or how rural. Did you know the U.S. Postal Service travels 1.5 billion miles each year to deliver your mail? That's 6,381 trips to the moon, or 16 trips to the sun. And with more than 30,000 post offices spread across the U.S., the Postal Service makes sure everyone in the country can send mail and packages to destinations anywhere in the world. Want to know the best part? The Postal Service receives no taxpayer dollars, aside from a few $1 million for good works, such as mailings for the blind. Instead, it relies on the sale of postage, products, and services to fund its operations, and it employs more than 100,000 veterans. Now, you may have heard that the Postal Service is in financial trouble, but that's where it gets complicated. With virtually every business in the country relying on it in some way, the Postal Service actually generated $70.6 billion in operating revenue in 2018. If it were a private sector company, the Postal Service would rank 40th in the Fortune 500. But the Postal Service is not a private company. It's overseen by Congress, which created the Postal Regulatory Commission as a check on the Postal Service's rate, classification, and other powers. However, Congress also imposed financially crippling obligations. In 2006, Congress passed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. It required the Postal Service to set aside funds for retiree health benefits 75 years in advance, a huge expenditure that the U.S. Postal Service cannot pay and still deliver the mail. And it's something no other company or government entity is required to do. As a result, the Postal Service has defaulted on more than $43 billion in those pre-funded payments by the end of the 2018 fiscal year. At the same time, the Postal Regulatory Commission is considering large rate hikes for the business community, rate hikes which could negatively impact 90% of Postal Service revenues, $1.4 trillion in sales, and 7.5 million private sector jobs. In addition, these rate hikes would mean large price increases for Postal Service consumers like you and me. If the Commission imposes major rate hikes, mailers and shippers, including major e-commerce companies, would simply find cheaper shipping alternatives, causing the Postal Service to further sink financially and compromising its ability to do its job for all Americans. In fact, the price of a stamp got boosted a nickel in January 2019, which was 10% and the biggest single price increase for a stamp ever. If we want to preserve affordable, universal mail and package delivery that involves no taxpayer funds, there's a solution. Enact postal reform legislation. A bipartisan proposal would remove tens of billions of dollars from the Postal Service's balance sheet, at no cost to taxpayers, restructuring the service's retiree benefits, making them more like the private sector and the rest of the federal government. and it would add a one-time responsible increase to postal rates that the industry and consumers can live with, provided it mitigates and does not add to any increase from the Postal Regulatory Commission. Postal reform legislation would immediately put the service and the private industry empowering it on firmer financial ground. Even more important, it would help fulfill our obligation and the necessity, especially for rural America, to make sure that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night will stay the U.S. Postal Service from doing its job. Visit 21stcenturypostal.org to learn more about postal reform and the industries that support and rely on the U.S. Postal Service.